If we could come back together for our last panel, everybody find a seat. There's still snacks in the back and seats at the round table. For our last panel, which will discuss constructive dialogue and disagreement and value-neutral use spaces to understand the contemporary lesson. So I will leave it to Professor Alridge to introduce and get it started.
Good afternoon. So I will be moderating this session, and I will go ahead and get started with our introductions. First, we have Dr. Joyce King, who holds the Benjamin E. Mays Endowed Chair in Urban Teaching, Learning, and Leadership at Georgia State University. She is past president of the American Educational Research Association, and she serves on the National African American Reparations Commission. She was director of teacher education at Santa Clara University for 12 years before she served in senior academic affairs positions at the University of New Orleans, Medgar Evers College, and Spelman College, where she was provost. She taught her first African American Studies course when she was a senior at Stanford University in 1969. She holds 2 degrees from Stanford, sociology in 1969 and social foundations of education, 1974. Her books and articles and research focus on a role for culture in education. Next, we have Stephen L. Becton, who is the National Program Director for Equity and Inclusion for the International Educational Foundation, Facing History and Ourselves. He writes and speaks for Facing History on urban education and equity issues in and beyond the classroom. He presents at national conferences, he writes blogs, and conducts workshops and webinars for educators and for the larger community, centered on having transformative conversations about race and education. He is a skilled facilitator and sought-after presenter. Stephen is a doctoral candidate at the University of Memphis, where his research focuses on historical context of educational inequity and anti-racist pedagogies. Next, we have Uche Chima, who is a second-year undergraduate student from Houston, Texas. She is a prospective public policy leadership major and is passionate about advocacy for communities in which she represents. She seeks to combat the systematic issues that exist in these spaces by studying their history and analyzing them from a business and political standpoint. In her presentation titled "The Problem with Talking," she explores the ways in which pushing for conversations regarding critical history can actually be problematic. As she dives into this topic from a minority student perspective, she takes us on a journey in which she encourages all to self-reflect and consider how we all contribute to building efficient, value-considerate spaces. We also have Alan Ward, who is a teacher in middle grade social studies, in the middle school grade social studies realm, and he's been doing for a little over 10 years. He's also coached and mentored students from all different backgrounds. He has received multiple awards for his work, including the Superintendent Spotlight and multiple awards for coaching. And last, we have Catherine Powell, who is a senior at TCW High School. Let's give them all a round of applause. So welcome. So we'll start with Dr. King.
Thank you, Brother Moderator. I enjoyed the last panel, even though I came in just before they finished. Let's give them another round of applause. Really gave us some powerful ideas. You have a handout in your package that you should take out, because we're going to walk through that together. That will really be the focus of my presentation. The handout is called Before and After Braveheart. Looks like a chronology or a timeline. When you get it, just wave it like this so I know you have it. Very good, looks good. You can follow instructions. So I create a value-neutral space in my classes at Georgia State University, teaching adults and building their capacity to be more human and to transcend the mythologies that we experience as ideology. One of those mythologies has to do with teaching African American history as if it starts with slavery. So if you look at this handout, it starts in 7/11. And it's before and after Braveheart, because a film that I use in my class is Braveheart with Mel Gibson. How many of you have seen it? Hollywood, okay. So one of the things I do is I ask my students, why is the young lady in the wedding scene crying? And I get this blank look. They don't remember that there was a wedding scene. They don't remember why the lady was crying. And I said, but you saw the film. Yeah, we saw the film, but we don't remember that part. Well, that whole scene is why Mel Gibson becomes a hero. Because she was lynched. And why was she lynched? Because the policy of oppression when the British were oppressing the Scots was that every Scottish serfette, the new bride, had to go up to the big house and sleep with the British lord for the first night, because the Scottish people were considered less than civilized, and the British oppressors determined that they should breed out the Scottishness. This is European history. No black people, no white people in the scene. There were no white people then. There were British and Scottish. So we walk through this timeline in order to recover knowledge that has just sort of been erased. And the reason why my students cannot remember that scene in the film is because they don't have what the anthropologists call a functional complex. You don't have the conceptual framework to place what you've just observed in a meaningfulness in your brain. So you see it, but it just flips on right on by. And you don't realize you're looking at lynching, the origin of lynching. So when Mel Gibson saw that his girlfriend's throat was cut, he becomes a hero to free the Scottish people. So let's kind of walk through this. I have maybe 5 minutes left. 7/11. African Moors conquered Spain. Most of my students don't realize that the Africans ruled Spain and Portugal for 700 years. And Cordova was the capital of Europe's most civilized city with paved, lamp-lit streets, libraries, and public baths. That's 7/11. Moving on down, before Roman times, slavery was normal in Britannia. From the 9th to the 12th centuries, Dublin, Ireland was a major slave trading center involving the Gaelic, Pictish, Vikings, Saxons, and other kingdoms. Now, this is not to say, oh, we all, all lives matter, we all had bad history. No, it is to help my students understand how oppression works wherever it works, and that we are all inheritors of a history which, in terms of building capacity, sort of opens up the mental space so that we can recognize, hey, maybe there's some things we need to learn about how we got to be the way they are if we're going to have the capacity to do something about it. So one of the strongest examples that kind of affects my students, is anybody here of Irish heritage? Okay, don't feel bad. Okay, thank you. I'm going to read the small paragraph in the really small print at the bottom. This is what a chronicler with the British who had colonized that part of what now is Great Britain. I'm at 1180s and the small print. So Gerald of Wales, a chronicler with the British colonizers, had this to say about the Irish. The Irish are a rude people, subsisting on the produce of their cattle only and living themselves like beasts, a people who had not yet departed from the primitive habits of pastoral life, neither willing to give up their old habits or learn anything new, abandoning themselves to idleness and immersed in sloth. Their greatest delight is to be exempt from toil. Their richest possession, the enjoyment of liberty. This people then is truly barbarous. Indeed, all their habits are barbarisms. In whatever requires industry, they are worthless. Does that sound familiar in terms of how we might be describing groups today? You know, build that wall. So, what we experience as value neutral in my class is a reconnection with the history that has been left out of our self-construction and our identity. I created this timeline when I was on my way to Halifax, Nova Scotia, to do a workshop with teachers, and I wanted to tell them something about their history. So I'm a great fan of Outlander. Anybody watch Outlander? All right, okay, me and you. Outlander is, you know, history of Scotland, swashbucklers, warriors, whatever. But if you look over at 1715, 1746, the Jacobite Scottish rebels were forcibly transported to the colonies after the uprising of Culloden in 1745. And they were transported to Nova Scotia, New Scotland, New Scotia. So this is a challenge for most people, whether you're in Brazil, whether you're here, wherever, to recover the history that's been lost that has helped to shape your capacity to know yourself and to appreciate others in the struggle for human freedom. And I ended this with 1812, the U.S.-British War. Francis Scott Key, a slaveholding lawyer, wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, which applauds slavery. The British granted freedom to the enslaved who fought on their side and resettled these black refugees in Nova Scotia after the war. So what does this relate to, 1812, in terms of what's happening in our society today with maybe the NFL? Colin Kaepernick. Colin Kaepernick. Colin Kaepernick? Okay, all right. So there are many places that we can connect our students to moral reasoning, their agency, their capacity to choose what role they can play in the struggle for justice. And this is just an example of a teaching tool that we can all produce using our capacity to share our values, but in a way that allows everyone to enter in and not be accused of doing something, not being accused of being racist, but to understand better how we came to be where we are today. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. King. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm going to start in a different place because it's great to follow what Dr. King shared, in that I'm going to sort of let you experience a little bit of what Dr. King just shared by taking you into a Facing History classroom activity, and I'll tell you more about what we experienced, but I want you to experience this first. Let me set this up. This is Jesus Cologne. And you have to watch this with students because they will read it as Jesus' colon. But it's not Jesus' colon, it's Jesus Cologne. Tell them to notice the accents there. but Jesus Cologne is a self-described Puerto Rican black man that finds himself in a subway station in New York in the 1950s, and he's in this dilemma. He's trying to decide whether to help this white woman or not. I'm going to show you a part of this film. We're going to do a quick exercise, letting you discuss his dilemma a little bit, and then I connect it to what we're talking about today.
Sometimes one thing happens to change your life. How you look at things, how you look at yourself. I remember one particular event. It was when, 1955, 56, a long time ago. Anyway, I'd been working at night. I wrote for the newspaper, and, we had deadlines. It was late, after midnight, on the night before Memorial Day. I had to catch the train back to Brooklyn, the West Side IRT. This lady got onto the subway at 34th Street and Penn Station. A nice-looking white lady in her early 20s. Somehow, she managed to push herself in with a baby in her right arm and a big suitcase in her left hand. 2 children, a boy and a girl, about 3 and 5 years old, trailed after her. Anyway, at Nevin Street, I saw her preparing to get off at the next station, Atlantic Avenue. That's where I was getting off to. It was going to be a problem for her to get off. 2 small children, a baby in her arm, and a suitcase in her hand. And there I was, also preparing to get off at Atlantic Avenue. I couldn't help but imagine the steep, long concrete stairs going down to the Long Island Railroad and up to the street. Should I offer my help? Should I take care of the girl and the boy, take them by their hands until they reach the end of that steep, long concrete stairs? Courtesy is important to us Puerto Ricans. And here I was, hours past midnight, and the white lady with a baby in her arm, a suitcase, and 2 white children, badly needing somebody to help her. I remember thinking, I'm a Negro and a Puerto Rican. Suppose I approach this white lady in this deserted subway station late at night. What would she say? What would be the first reaction of this white American woman? Would she say, yes, of course, you may help me? Or would she think I was trying to get too familiar? Or would she think worse? What do I do if she screamed when I went to offer my help? I hesitated.
He hesitated. So what I want you to do, just quickly, turn to somebody next to you, just one person, because you're only going to have like 90 seconds to 2 minutes. What do you think Jesus did? Do you think he helped the lady or not? And what's driving your decision? What do you think she did? What he did? Did he help her or not? And what are you basing your decision on? Just discuss that quickly with an elbow partner. Okay, how many of you all are leaning toward, raise your hand if you're leaning towards that he did help her. Boy, educators are so optimistic, I tell you. And how many of y'all are leaning more toward he did not help her? Okay, all right. So let's see what Jesus did.
And then I pushed by her like I saw nothing, as if I were insensitive to her need. I was like a rude animal walking on 2 legs, just moving on, half running along the long subway platform, leaving the children and the suitcase and the woman with the baby in her arm. I ran up the steps of that long concrete stairs in 2s, and when I reached the street, the cold air slapped my warm face. Perhaps the lady was not prejudiced after all. If you were not that prejudiced, I failed you, dear lady. If you were not that prejudiced, I failed you. I failed you too, children. I failed myself. I buried my courtesy early on Memorial Day morning. So here is the promise I made to myself back then. If I am ever faced with an occasion like that again, I am going to offer my help regardless of how the offer is going to be received. Then I will have my courtesy with me again.
So you would think after that exercise, your students are one day are kind of like, I was right, you were wrong. They're doing that whole thing. But also they're probably geared and ready to learn, like what's going on here, right? So at Facing History in Ourselves, we committed ourselves to really thinking about how do we bring a rigor to helping kids think about these issues of learning in moral spaces, value neutral spaces, that it has to be grounded in a rigorous learning journey. In fact, I love that we started the conference talking about equity. As a matter of fact, as you all know, too often, many of our students from marginalized communities suffer from that soft bigotry or low expectations, right? Where there is no rigor, where people claim to do social emotional learning, they claim to do anti-bias work, they claim to do culture responsive work, and then they start with lowering the rigor. We believe that students are moral philosophers, but also that they're critical thinkers. That the role of education is to help students not to find their voices. They already have voices, right? But give them an opportunity to develop and give them a platform to use their voices, right? And this happens in a deep, rigorous way. Jesus, if you think about it more deeply, there are a number of important themes, connecting this to today. I just listed some. You can think of some. Historical racism and sexism, right, is so in this narrative. Systemic racism, gender norming, right? So Jesus is grappling with not just race, but he's grappling with gender, right? He's also this ideal of self-actualization, self-identification. Think about the power of historical racism. Everything in Jesus said helped this woman. And what a great conversation to have with our students, right? What is it out there that's so powerful that will make you go against everything that you believe in, that keep you daily from being the best version of yourself? And how do you press beyond that? Also like the fact that Jesus said if he had a chance to do this again, that he would make a different decision. What another powerful reflection for our students to think about that some days they get it right and some days they do not, right? And that our students aren't froze in their worst decision or in their worst moment, right? That we want to honor growth mindsets. One of the worst places to hang out as an educator is the teacher lounge, So you hear about this kid in the 3rd grade that gave his 3rd grade teacher a hard time. He's now in the 6th grade, and the 3rd grade teacher's still mad at him and telling the 6th grade teacher how bad he was in the 3rd grade. Might that student have grown since the 3rd grade? So these are lessons for adults as well. So this is also about moral reasoning, right? Ethical decision making, critical thinking. All these skills that we want for all of our students. So in these environments where we're trying to help students really to think about the world around them and their connection to it, doing it in these thoughtful ways is helpful. And we're intentional about this at Facing History. This is our pedagogical approach that if you really want to have informed civic participation from students, that you do want to ground it in intellectual rigor. You don't want to just show, hey, let's talk about the election. Well, let's get some primary source documents on the table. Let's talk about what the issues are in the election. Again, honoring them as thoughtful, critical thinking people, but also with emotion engagement. When you get that blank stare from students that it seems like they're not interested in the content that you're so excited about, it's because they're not. It's because that we've not done a good job of connecting it to their own realities, right? Where they have that emotion engagement. And also this ideal of ethical reflection. Jesus was in an ethical dilemma. Ethics is important in education. In fact, education without an ethical, moral compass is actually dangerous. Most of the atrocities that have happened throughout the world were led by educated people, educated Eichmanns, right? Those that perpetuated the transatlantic slave trade were the aristocrats of society, right? So education is dangerous without a moral, ethical compass. And so when these three things work together, we believe we have the best chance to engage engage students in their informed civic responsibility. We talk often about getting students to do something. We don't want them to just do something. We want them to have informed civic responsibility. And then finally, what I want to share with you is something our friend psychologist John Uche said. You do have to create the right space to have important conversation with students. John Uche said, identity is not just about self-revelation. It's not just about something you come to know about yourself. It's also in part made up of how other people see you. We've been talking about that all day, and how you see yourself. We call this concept in psychology the looking glass self, the mirror self. Teachers and everybody who work with students have to create this emotional space where it's safe but challenging, where people can be themselves, where people can take chances and fail. Not fail backwards, fail forward, right? Where people can tell stories about themselves, reveal things about themselves without risk of derision, without fear of being marginalized, without safety. There is no learning. The psychologists out there can tell you that the brain literally shuts down when people are socially and emotionally unsafe. So I want to add this nugget to our conversation. I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists and connect to what we're talking about today. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Well, 24 hours ago, I had no idea I was going to be sitting here. Actually, before I went to bed last night, I had no idea that I was going to be standing up here. And I'm going to tell her all our secrets. And I'm in my pajamas, and my son wakes me up around 6:15, and then my wife comes in the room, and she says, "Guess what, Alan? You're going to be a panelist at the new UVA event." I was like, "What?" And so she was like, "Don't worry about it. Just tell her your experiences. Just tell them your experience that you've been in as a teacher." So that's kind of what I'm here to do. I have taught 8th grade social studies and a little bit of 6th grade social studies over the past 10 years in affluent areas and areas with low socioeconomic income. So just kind of been all over the place a little bit in terms of seeing like the different kind of demographics and the ways that kids are taught. It's interesting, right? Especially like, so I've been for me, when going to like one of the more affluent areas, I'll tell you guys a quick story. We were having these like mock elections. And it was it was very affluent school, like Hydro Flask and all that. I didn't even know what a Hydro Flask was till And, everybody got a chance to we were talking about like the Democratic primaries and all that good stuff, and everybody had a chance to kind of, be a different candidate. And obviously Trump got to be one of them. And at this school, it was like it was great, but with the Trump thing, it was just different. Like the kids really like embraced Trump, which is cool. You have that right. But I feel like, but then after one of the debates at the end, we got back to the class. I would hear some kids start to chant like, "Build the wall, build the wall, build the wall," in class. Now, I've built pretty good relationships with these kids, and I know, like, at least from my relationship with them, they don't seem like racist or anything like that. But I heard it a couple of times, but then the last time I heard it, I was just like, "Look, guys, I'm gonna tell y'all what y'all look like. I don't think you know what you look like, but I'm gonna tell you what you look like from other perspectives." I said, "You guys look like entitled bigots. You love the hip hop music, you love the culture, you love all these different cultures, but when it's time to like really like do something, like it's a joke, it's a video game, it's a Sims game for you guys." I said, "I've been in schools where, I have kids that I love, that I genuinely love, and their parents have been deported. This is real life. This is real life. They've been deported. And they're gone, and who knows if I'll ever see them again. And you guys are over here joking about build the wall because of the community that you guys live in. And then all of a sudden, everybody got really quiet. And I was like, oh, snap. You know? And they said, oh, you know what, Coach? Man, you're right, Coach, you're right. I was like, phew, Jesus, thank you. And so, because I just got this job, like, come on. And so it worked out, right? And it just kind of like broadened their perspective. They never thought how this could how it could affect other people, right? And so those are some of the some of the experiences that that I was able to that I was able to show them and talk to them about. But they really do. It's like they live in a bubble, and no one ever really talks about racism or classism. They'll say like racism is wrong, but they won't like really break it down and understand like situations. I've told the kids about situations with me where I've been like pulled over by the police in the way that I grew up and that kind of stuff without getting a ticket or anything like that. And they're like, what is this is real? I was like, yes, it's real. This stuff is real. Like they're not talking about this stuff out of nowhere. And so when I talk about this stuff, it's just like, you could see their eyes just open up. Like, I can't believe this stuff is actually happening. So that's what I like experienced like in the more affluent areas. But they're brilliant. Like you can tell they're just like, they've got like their writing is amazing. Most of them have both parents like in the household, and so they can like do all of their like they do a lot extra studying at home, and there's accountability at home, and there's tutors, and so you can tell like these kids are gonna be going to great schools and they just like the future is like theirs. And then there's also like the other schools that I've gone to where things are a little bit different. The kids are just as smart, not as entitled, but very, very intelligent, but they face other obstacles. Some of them, like where I came from, some of the kids, they lived in mobile homes or efficiency lodges, or, a lot of them might have single parents and like the parents are doing the best they can, but you got to work, right? You got to put food on the table. And if you don't show up, if you don't put food on the table and you're not there, you might not be. So sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So if you're, it's either do you work or do you stay at home with your kids and make sure they do their homework? And that's not fair. It's a little bit depressing. It's really sad. Another thing that I noticed was within the curriculum. So the more affluent schools, I see more like projects, where the kids can really dive into the content, right, and get like real world like understandings and put them in where at the other schools that I've been to with what we call low SES, right, is everything's based off of the test. And it's just pressure all the time coming from a teacher's perspective. It's just like test. Is this affiliated with the test? Because if it's not affiliated with the test, we got to move on and go to the next section and then just keep reinforcing the same information over and over and over, because at the end of the day, what matters in those conditions are test scores. So it's tough. It's really different. And I guess the last little part is one of the things like I really want for kids to be able to like talk about, and we talk about it in my classes all the time, is just what some of these folks talk about is like understanding like why things are like the way they are. So talking about things like racism, classism, even bigger like the prison pipeline, right? Like these kind of things they don't talk about in school. So when you don't talk about these things in school, what do you expect with these affluent areas where everybody's in a bubble? What do you expect, right? Seriously. Like if all you guys talk about like is what's in your community and you don't know what's going on outside of the community, then it's nature of the beast to just be like, well, that's not that serious because we're just talking about what's going on here. And so when you see somebody act a certain way, then all of a sudden, you're like, what's wrong with them? No, what's wrong with you? Like, how do you not know these things? So, sorry, I feel like I'm just, all right, anyway, so yeah, that's kind of my information there, that my tidbit as a teacher experiencing low socioeconomic schools versus affluent schools. Both are very, very intelligent, both are highly capable, but one group has a little bit more obstacles, but not to say that the more affluent areas don't have pressures too, right? Like, because the more affluent areas, at least what I've also seen there is that, with that entitlement, kids can be, they can have a level of entitlement where they're so used to getting what they want. If they don't get what they want, then bad things can happen. I won't elaborate on that. So that's my tidbit. Thank you very much.
Hello. Hi, my name is Uche, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about having constructive dialogue within classrooms and, my feelings regarding that. Okay, so I'm going to start off by telling you a story first. When I was 17, so not too long ago, like 2 years ago, I came home on my birthday. And I decided, I'm gonna go out, I'm gonna have fun with my friends while, my mom was at work. So my whole plan was, my school had early dismissal that day. So I was gonna come back home, take the key of like our old car, and then I was gonna go to Starbucks, because they give out like free drinks on your birthday. And then I was gonna go get snow cones with my friends. So I was like, cool, I'm gonna do this all under 2 hours. And of course, without my mom knowing, not because like, I didn't wanna ask for permission, but also because I didn't have a license. So I was like, and I never took any driving classes. So I got the key, I came home, and I was like, wow, I'm in this, I went to Starbucks, got my drink, I was sipping, and then I went to go get the snow cones. My friends saw me, I was like, hey girl, let me park real quick. So I started getting in this parking space, right? And I realized like, whoa, I entered this at a totally wrong angle. And like, I don't know what to do. Like, I just went into like shock. And like, I guess I forgot to hit the brake because then I just like smashed into the car right in front of me. And this was a brand new car. This was a parked car. I was like, oh, my life is over. I didn't know what to do. And now looking back at this, I'm like, that's probably how educators feel today, whenever we're really progressive and we come into these classrooms and we're like, you know what, let's talk about race. Let's talk about sexism. Let's really get into these critical histories. And we have our lesson plans, we enter these spaces and realize like, whoa, I did this totally wrong. But then you freak out, you don't know whether to hit the brakes, hit the accelerator, and you just smash into this perfect new car that was just minding its business. And I personally feel that, there's a lot of problematic things regarding this issue whenever we want to have constructive dialogue. And one of them is that we don't necessarily plan for it the right way. We're all well-meaning, we all want to change lives, but you can't change the lives of people you don't know. And I think the first problem is that whenever we have diversity and inclusion initiatives, we think just putting a bunch of people who look very different in one room that's the end of the journey. Like, we've done it, good job, congratulations. And we're too quick to congratulate ourselves for it. As we can see here, UVA always releases something like this every single year. We have the largest and most diverse class. And, we expect to get the benefits of diversity by just placing these people in this space. Everyone knows diverse groups create more efficient solutions. Diverse companies usually have a higher revenue at the end of the year. But whenever you just place, especially minority students in these spaces and don't really value them or their experiences and actually create a constructive learning environment, what you're doing is just using them as like tokens. You're just using them as little chess pieces in your game. And this is quite evident in like jokes that my friends and I make. Sometimes whenever like there's a lot of like Black students in one space, we're like, hey y'all, let's pose for a diversity picture. And like that's exactly what happened in this picture. And I found it on Cavalier Daily a couple weeks later while my friends and I were at convocation. That's actually me over there. And you know, I feel like even though like things like this, you know, we're joking about it, whenever you're in classrooms and you know, you want your voice to be heard, those like situations aren't really that effective. And I feel like whenever we just place different people in a space, this is what we think, you know, we're creating. We're just putting a bunch of color on a canvas and it looks messy. But you know, when we actually take time to foster, you know, the skills of each person in that environment, what we can do is actually create a cohesive masterpiece. And then the next thing that I feel like is really important to talk about in these spaces is the fact that a lot of the students who you expect to actually reach out to are facing different types of traumas. They're facing racial trauma, which is when one experiences a lot of like racist experiences, and it doesn't just end there. It's not like, oh, you know, that's it. Whenever they're in the classrooms, this actually affects, you know, students' brains. They're trained to like think on like a fight or flight instinct all the time. And whenever you've experienced so much trauma, especially within a large population, you face historical trauma, and your brain is more sensitive to like strangers or like strange situations. So although you're not a teacher like waving a gun at a student's face, that's how they're perceiving it, because you don't know them, you have never made connections with them, and yet you're expecting so much of them within one space and one like aspect of time. And this doesn't just affect them in the classroom, but it goes on to affect people's health, which is why a lot of times like Black graduates end up dying much earlier than like white high school dropouts or white high school graduates. And it often makes students, minority students, think with a survival brain rather than just a learning brain. They're really like focused on threats, so whenever like they're not used to certain situations, they're not able to process their emotions correctly, which is why sometimes, you know, minority students won't say anything in classes, it's really uncomfortable, or sometimes whenever they are actually really invoked with emotion, people like to say, oh, you're being aggressive, you're taking it too seriously. And like in my experience, no, like that's our life. You know, whenever that clock hits 2 o'clock or whenever that door shuts, that's not it. And I remember even questioning this in one of my classes called Landscape of Black Education. At the end, I was like, you know, what is the point of us learning all of this? Because at the end of this, you know, we've done this project, it's great, I've got my grade, but like this is my life. When I leave out of this classroom, I will have to actually go navigate through these higher education spaces as a Black woman. And you know, I think that's what a lot of minority students think about, but we don't necessarily think about when we want to have these conversations with them. And so whenever you are a student that's thinking on like with a survival brain, it's so much harder for you to reach, you know, the abilities of your other classmates. However, let's see, whenever you receive like the help of a teacher and you actually, you know, are being like spoken to and you know your skills are being developed, it makes it so much easier to reach that point. And if you think about it, you know, whenever we're having these conversations, I feel like one of the problems is that we just look at it as talking. And whenever people are just talking, it's like music, I mean, it's just notes being played. No music is actually being orchestrated. And when we do that, we're not really creating conversations. And I feel that when you don't have connections with students and when you don't have connections in the classroom, there's no conversation to be had. And when there's no conversation, there's no learning. And if there's no learning in these spaces, can we actually call them classrooms? Can we actually call ourselves educators? Or are we just there, you know, doing a little focus group? And I think 3 things that we can really look at to help solve this problem, these are 3 hard pills to swallow. The first one is that, you know, we can self-reflect, especially I feel like educators, you know, often go into these spaces being very well-meaning, but I feel like there's a lot of pressure being put on educators to be perfect, you know, to know everything, and it's like, oh, I've never had biases in my life, and you know, I'm so aware of this, I have all this theoretical experience, I've done the research, but if you don't know yourself, how can you get to know somebody else? And the next thing I feel like we could do is share the responsibility of actually creating inclusive spaces. You know, when we make diversity just an office or an initiative only 2 people have to focus on, that's literally the impact we're gonna have. It's just gonna be 2 people. And just like at UVA, where like things like honor is something that we all have to, you know, like hold our ends to, and in every single classroom, there's like the honor pledge. I feel like if we create spaces where inclusion is actually, you know, celebrated, then we can actually replicate this in all other aspects of our life. The average American spends 1/3 of their life at work. And if you really think about it, educational spaces are businesses. So whatever culture that we cultivate here will be replicated in every other aspect of our life. The third thing is I think it's really important to understand how conversations work, but it's more important to set the scene, you know, and I was reading an article the other day, and it was called "Dear White Teachers, You Can't Love Your Black Students If You Don't Know Them." And if we're being honest, this is what a lot of our classrooms now look like, especially like in minority spaces. And not saying there's anything wrong with it, not saying, you know, like people are being intrusive in spaces that aren't theirs, but I think it's really important when you enter that space that you understand that whatever is going on in that space is just a reflection of what is going on in that child's head from their community. It's not only how you see it, but it's more important to see how they perceive, you know, aspects of their community. So I think one really important thing in getting to know, you know, them is getting to know yourself. You have to be able to challenge yourself. You know, what privileges have I had? Where are my shortcomings? You know, do I not, like, it's not just enough to say, oh, I love all my kids. You know, you have to be social justice warriors as teachers. You know, you have to fight for your children through everything. And then also, whenever your students are trying to understand how to go about these conversations the right way or how to put their emotions together, will I be able to stand alongside them no matter what? And I think, you know, it's definitely important to ask yourself these questions, but more so important to not feel pressured to say, you know, to have perfect answers to everything. Because I think that's where we really disconnect with white students in these spaces, because they feel like, oh, you know, they don't really have anything to say, or, you know, their voices, you know, don't matter in this situation. And honestly, I feel like they do. And I think especially when there are a lot of white teachers teaching these courses, it's important to connect on that level and say, hey, you know, I've had these biases as well, or, you know, I didn't understand this as well. And when a student really gets authenticity from you and sees that you're genuine in your efforts, then they will actually be able to connect better with you. And I also say, I also believe that it's important for Black teachers to have that kind of perspective as well, or like go through this self-reflection moment, because not everybody that looks like you will have your experience. And I think that's something that we also, you know, do whenever we create these spaces. We think, oh, all Black, we're just gonna put a whole bunch of Black students together and, you know, they can really tackle the issue of like racism. And to be very honest, as a Nigerian American, you know, coming to America, I've never experienced racism until like I got here and I knew that was a thing. I never knew slavery was a thing until I got here. And so whenever like I'm in these spaces, you know, and I'm expected to actually talk about these things, I had to go through that learning period myself. I had to also go through that reflection. Another thing is that I feel that in sharing the responsibility, this is like, we think, you know, having these conversations just stop in the classroom. But whenever we don't have these conversations the right way, things like this go on, you know, at UVA. So for example, this is Beta Bridge. You know, it's like kind of like a community space where different organizations, like, you know, write about their, you know, upcoming events or like celebrating people, things like that. And this was the Founders Week for one of the Black sororities here at UVA. And so they painted Beta Bridge, and like it's known, you know, when someone paints something there, you don't touch it, you don't write over it, you know, that's vandalism, that's disrespectful, it's just breaking our community of trust. But yet we see a white supremacist slogan written all over this, you know. And it's crazy to think, you know, whenever things like the riot happen here, we think, oh, you know, those are those few people in Charlottesville. You know, we don't really like do that here. But those people were also in classrooms once. And when we don't engage them in conversations, they're not gonna have a chance to change their worldview. They're not gonna have a chance to actually grow because we kept them away from that conversation. I think the last thing that's really important is setting the scene. So we all know how, you know, the communication module works. So if I, you know, have a thought, you know, chocolate is really great, but if I don't say it in like a chocolate is really great, you're not gonna get that energy. And from there, you're going to have a different way of how you interpret that, and how you interpret that affects how you say something back to me. That's how the communication module works. But I think it's really important to understand that, but more so important to set the scene. So let's say we're setting a scene of a beautiful day. Of course, you want some clouds in there. You want it to be nice and bright. You want some grass, some flowers, keep it colorful, keep it beautiful. Of course, you want some noise, some sound, some beautiful melodies, so you're gonna add some birds. And I think whenever we actually take time to step by step create these spaces as such, then we'll actually be able to reap the benefits of having diverse groups in there. It's only when you actually set that scene, when you talk to your students, say, okay, what are our limits when we're talking about this? What change do y'all actually want to see? What problems do y'all have understanding these things? It's when the students feel engaged in creating these spaces that they'll feel engaged in these conversations. And I think that's really important for us to focus on. And the last point I just wanted to hit was like, while going through creating like what I wanted to say to y'all, I was really confused. Like, this is the first time I've done anything like this. And like, I was just looking at like the long name of this conference, and I was like, what is a value neutral space? I remember asking Dr. Deutsch, I was like, I don't know what that is. And like one of the graduate students at in the meeting was like, oh, value neutral spaces, like usually where like spaces, where the values of different people aren't really like considered, not in a bad way, but just like, be true to yourself, say what you like feel like you need to say. And the way I interpreted that was, I feel like creating value neutral spaces is like saying I don't see color. And I feel like whenever you don't see the color of people, you don't appreciate their individuality. You don't appreciate their experiences. And if you don't appreciate someone, you're not going to be inclined to respect them. You're not going to be inclined to listen to them. So in understanding how I would want to be approached in that space, or how I would want to take my part in that space, I went ahead and I coined this little term called a value considerate space. And I think there are three really good points to hit whenever you're thinking of creating a value-considerate space. So my definition of that is a space cultivated through consistent effort to recognize and work with the diversity in values and experiences of others in order to engage in cohesive and thought-provoking conversations. So the first part is that I think it's really important to understand that we don't have these conversations by one day coming in the class and saying, hey, y'all, we're going to talk about racism. You have to put consistent effort into it. You have to build that relationship with your students in a way that they feel like, hey, my voice is actually valued in these spaces. Because especially as a Black woman in a higher educational, atmosphere, sometimes I feel a little awkward talking about things like that because I don't want to be viewed as aggressive. And we all know the stereotype of like, Black women are really loud and things like that. And whenever I'm in these spaces, I wonder, well, if I'm so loud, why is no one listening to me? And I always have to ask myself that, and it makes me really uncomfortable speaking at times, but I feel like whenever there's consistent effort to show, hey, you're not being loud, you're being passionate. You're not being loud, you're knowledgeable about these things. Your experiences or your evidence, everything that you're saying is really important. I feel like great conversations could be had in those spaces. The second thing is we need to recognize and actually work with the diversity of others, not just in color, but experiences and in life stories and in thoughts and things like that. And the last part is I feel like if we do both of these things, we can actually engage in thought-provoking conversations. I feel like if a conversation just ends at that, oh, okay, guys, we're done talking about this. Was it really worth it to talk about it? Whenever we leave here, the things that we hear are things that we want to actually implement in our lives. And if the conversations we're having in classrooms don't make us actually want to create change of some kind, I don't think they're worth having at all. And that's the problem that I find with talking. And I think now that we understand, the problems with getting into these spaces the wrong way, the effect that they have on minority students, and actually how to create a value-neutral space, I think this can be us, on a journey to reaching more effective communication. Thank you. Hello. Kind of nervous, guys. About an hour and a half ago, before this panel started, Ms. Jahari asked me to talk about classroom experiences that I have been in. First, I want to say my name is Cameron Powell. I go to T.C. Williams High School. I'm a senior, and I take AP and DE classes. So in these classes, it's more of like, I don't want to say separated, but we're separated. You have more of the white students on one side, the 4 or 5 black students on the other, and it's like we don't really come together as a whole. I feel as though, like, how do I explain this? When we talk, they don't listen, and if we do talk, it's more of like we're looked over or we're not worthy enough, or, like, for example, I'm in AP Computer Science, and in this class right now we're doing something about our AP exam later on in the school year. And in this exam, we're supposed to do a poster or research paper about any software that we choose. And then a lot of these kids are choosing virtual reality, all that stuff, that technology stuff that I'm not into, but it's okay. So I chose to do iOS 13. It's a new innovative software. Most people have iPhones, so it's something that I thought was relevant to us. And in this generation, I feel like, who cares about the virtual reality? Why not the device that you hold in your hand 24/7? Who cares about the goggles that you put on your head, and why not the phone that you carry in your pocket that you look on for Instagram, you look on for Twitter to get the new whatever? So I say this because when I did this, I felt like I was the outcast in this classroom setting. And when I take this class, it's like out of 4 girls, I'm the only black girl in the classroom. So it's like everybody looks at me and they're like, oh, she's loud, she's ghetto, she does this, she does that. And I'm like, I'm not either of those stereotypes. I am a president of the AMV Alexandria Mount Vernon chapter of Alexandria. I am a peer advisor. I'm a counselor aide for the city of Alexandria. And I'm here speaking to you guys, and it's like, I don't sit at home and go on Instagram all day. I do my work, I get the A's and B's, I get my GPA, and I keep it moving. I don't really, when it comes down to the classroom setting, I feel as though the minority kids aren't valued. And when it comes down to certain things like the racism, and classism, I feel as though I'm belittled as a person and belittled as my race. So when it comes down to things like simple things like my AP exam or the DE test, I get the grades that I know I deserve. At the same time, I feel as though I did this on my own. I didn't ask the teacher for help, or the teacher didn't come to me like they come to the white kids. So how they come to the males in the classroom. It's like, I did this on my own, with my own research, with my own help, with my own asking, and it's like, you guys had the help, I didn't. You guys had the tutors, I don't. You guys have the parents who support you, I don't. You guys have the parents who are willing to step above and beyond, and my mom is the only person in the household who gets stuff done. There's no other income. It's her income, and that's it, it's final. So, thank you.
I'd like to thank the panel for such insights. So let's take this opportunity to open it up and take questions from the audience for our panelists. Jahari, we're not starting with you. Oh, no, just kidding. Go ahead. Sure. I'm just joking.
I just want to say, I thought this panel. Hello? Oh, I just thought this panel was fantastic.
Yes, indeed.
I might be a little biased, but I thought it was great. I guess I have a question about, I feel like we've talked about the role of teachers and students in kind of these classroom spaces, and how do we deal with these moral issues and dialogue. But what do you guys want, if you guys could comment on the role of parents in this process? And, I feel like they're the kind of third really salient piece of this that affects the type of topics we can talk about, how we can talk about these topics. And, as teachers and students and academics and practitioners, like, how do you feel about the parents' role in this kind of process?
I'll start quickly. First of all, I think we have to remove the barriers that keep parents from engaging in the process and quit making these assumptions that certain parents do not want to engage in the process. I taught school for 15 years. I never met a parent that didn't care about their kids, never. I met some parents with some challenges that didn't come to a meeting because the time of the meeting, the place of the meeting. I met some parents who went to the school that their kid went to and had such a bad experience that they don't want to come to the school. I meet parents with those kind of challenges. So one, we need to remove the systemic and historical challenges that keep parents from engaging. But two, I think we have a process where we empower students to invite their parents in ways that parents never thought they could contribute to schooling, right? So be intentional about saying, wow, my mother was an activist herself. My mother was around when Dr. King was speaking at Claiborne Temple in Memphis. Wow, can she come talk to the class? And my mother, who didn't graduate from college, go, your class want to hear from me? Right? So we have to do an assessment of what parents can do and then invite them. It's not that this thing that parents do not want to, they're not sure about where their entry point is, and it certainly hadn't been inviting. Thank you.
I'll add an experience. I talked about teaching at the university, and so one of the assignments that I give my students who are teachers or school administrators or counselors, if they do a class project, they have to find a community partner to work with them on their project. And most of the time, this really mystifies them. They don't know what I mean by the community. They don't know what I mean by partner. And I say, well, this is your opportunity as a budding intellectual to make sure that you're communicating to someone who's not in the academy, and that your work makes sense from their perspective. So one of my students years ago wanted to do a project on homeschool relations. And so her mother was actually a teacher. And so I said, sure, you can use your mother as your community partner. Freud used his niece for his research. So her mom was a teacher in a rural school in Louisiana, and her mother came to school when she came to our class when my student presented her project. So her mom talked about what she did as a teacher in the rural school to connect with parents. And as her mother talked with us about her practice as a teacher, I went to the board and started writing down the words she was using, because she was speaking about teaching and learning using a vocabulary that was not in our readings. And one of the words she used was wholesome. She said, as a teacher, we try to create a wholesome environment, wholesome learning environment for the children. And I stopped her. I said, could we just stop right there, because wholesome is not a word that we use in the academy today. So I just like to underscore that the learning goes both ways, and there's something that parents and community can offer for us as we try to be relevant and meaningful in our work.
I'm also interested in just kind of the pushback from parents, particularly with dealing with issues of race or justice. I'm thinking about with white parents, and like, how do you kind of deal with that fear of like, if you talk about the wrong topic or the wrong thing, you could lose a job, or so kind of how would you suggest approaching that reality?
Well, my students often experience that. that fear. But what I say to them is that there is a relationship that they need to establish. And through that relationship, they can have those conversations. That also means that they need a supportive administration. Sometimes the administration is bearing the fear, and it depends on what kind of community you're in. So it's an opportunity for negotiation, but not running away from the challenge.
I think another, at least what I do, is I try to present all perspectives. And if you present all perspectives, you know, maybe the parent's perspective, but then if the parent's perspective is not factual, you could say that that's okay, but these are the facts. And you present them with all the facts, then you let the kids kind of come up with however they want to do it. And if the parents don't like it, I mean, at least you presented all the facts. So that for me is the biggest thing, is just giving all perspectives.
That was such a great answer.
Any other questions?
Oh, I was going to answer that last
okay,
question.
sorry about that.
Okay, I think something that really causes a lot of like parents or even like white students to like push back from conversations like this is that sometimes like it's viewed as like an attack on self and not an attack on the situation. So they feel like, oh, okay, you're calling me the problem, but rather you weren't even there when the problem happened. So now we're just looking back to actually make sure that history doesn't repeat itself, or like, and that's where you can actually engage a student in and actually help them to understand, you know, we're treating you like superheroes in a sense. We're giving you a chance to actually right some wrongs. And I think it's really important to also understand that I feel like a lot of students, or some students, hate going to school sometimes. And not because they hate learning. And like working in an elementary school, like I really realized like no child really hates learning. Like children just want to know so much stuff. But it's when we create a culture that doesn't really engage them and pull them in and say, hey, you know, everything you're learning here is not just to pass a test. It's so that you can actually change the world with it. Then they actually see, you know, then they actually connect, you know, these great experiences to the idea of school, and not just, oh, I failed the test, I suck, you know, my life is over type of thing. Or, oh, you know, I feel like I'm attacked in this conversation. It's like, no, I'm recognizing the mistakes of somebody else, and I'm going to utilize my skill set to actually correct them in some way.
Thank you. We have a question right here.
Thank you. My name is Uche. I really appreciated this panel, and all the panels today, but this panel particularly, in that it really pushed the conversation around how intentional we have to be about the environment that we're shaping in order for these conversations to take place. And I really appreciate the student perspectives that you both brought to the conversation. I guess I'm curious to take it outside of the system of K-12 or higher education. Can you talk about either in your community or in the online space, right? Given that young people spend more time online than certainly, you know, those of us who didn't have that technology. What does that look like? Can we get to, you know, sort of value? I really appreciate the value considerate spaces in an online way for your generation, for all of us, but for your generation particularly.
Can you guys hear me? Okay. For the online aspect, I would say, sorry. I would say make it like a cultural, neutral kind of aspect in space where you can say what you want to say, but not make it offensive. So it's like, watch what you say and how you direct it, to who you direct it to. So I can say anything along the means of, I like black culture. Clearly, I'm black. So, but the white person or the other ethnicities might not take it as, oh, she's being all black power, all this, all that. But it's not in that way. I'm just expressing my culture and what I experience.
Thank you. Sure.
I honestly would say, like, having these conversations online is something that I always have problems with. And up to the point where, like, when I just see something going on, if I don't have, like, the factual evidence for it, I'm like, cool, I'm going to stay out of that conversation. But I would say, like, it's really interesting that you brought up how to have these conversations, especially online, because that's a whole different paradigm. Seeing that online, there's no, like, you're not really sure people's tone, you're not sure people's intentions, you're not sure anything outside of that 140 characters, that they state their opinion in. But I would say that something that I've found helpful is that whenever you're like kind of addressing problems, that you address the problem and not like you don't attack the person who's actually like bringing this up, and also like have context, like a lot of people, just see clickbaits and they're like, oh, okay, this is what this person meant. But it's like, no, let's back up, and let's actually look at why this person might be feeling this way. And I think that's also another important part of teaching in having these conversations in classrooms, whereas you're just looking at what that student is saying, in the classroom. You don't understand that that's based on their interpretation on what has happened in their community. And when you can actually go beyond, what you might see as the situation and actually think, okay, well, this is how that person has viewed it. This is how it's affected them. Then you can actually get down to their level and be like, okay, I understand you. And I think something else online is we all want to trend. We all want to be, the trending topic and, go famous and stuff like that. And it's like, no, sometimes you just need to put it down, deactivate your account a little, learn. And I think sometimes because we live in such a fast-paced world, we think, okay, oh my God, I read the book, why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? I'm woke. You know what? I'm gonna lead that movement. And it's like, no, sometimes you really just need to move away from that and not really assert yourself in those communities or in those environments, but listen. And I think that's something that being online really gives you the opportunity to do, is listen to different perspectives, because everybody's on there.
We are living in a world where you don't really know who you're interacting with online. And if we can also convey that in a developmentally appropriate way to young people so that they are aware that the online space is not a neutral space, but it's being used in some very divisive ways, deliberately. And that gets into the political reality that we're experiencing, and I've seen some adults succumb to that.
Okay, thank you. Let's give the panel another round of applause.